And then how does all these projects, outcomes, and activities allow them to craft that concept note, which will be then submitted to the GCF for additional support. And lastly, Jocelyn was able to share some additional concept note. And of course, we also have other funds that we're looking at, so there might be other low-hanging fruit. While we're dealing with GCF for these larger funds, we might be able to kind of stagger some initial things through other funds as well. So without further ado, unlike yesterday, we have no official opening, presentation, and so on, so I can hand over to Kepa to do a recap. Well, I've done a bit of a recap, so do your ice breaking and let's get the show on the road. Thank you.
Sorry, now you can hear me. I guess my professor voice didn't make it necessary. No? You heard what I say? Yes. Yeah. Okay, so I don't need to repeat. Thank you. Yeah, never mind. What we will do today is to, in particular, go through the barriers that we have identified as a result of literature analysis and also interviews that we have conducted throughout the project. Okay, and after we have a look at that, we will continue, after the coffee break. I don't know how we will do that in terms of time, but we will do a more detailed analysis of actions that can be implemented in order to strengthen private sector participation, and then what we want is to discuss with you the different alternatives, to go through the barriers and to design actions that eventually might form part of a bigger action plan. Okay, this would be the main outcome that we expect from today. Okay. What else? Same as yesterday, please do not hesitate to ask any question as I go along, and don't be shy, okay? You know that the good thing about this workshop is that we collaborate, that you ask questions. No? I don't want this, again, to be a lecture or anything like that. Anyway, to start, Jocelyn, another Mentimeter. What are we asking now, Jocelyn? So remember, the idea is that either you scan the QR code or you go to the website that was there and introduce a code. For those of you who do not have Wi-Fi and were not here yesterday, on that panel there, you have the Wi-Fi network and the password, if you need it. Okay. Probably you are with two screens? Yeah. If we didn't have any IT problems, no, it wouldn't be us. So, but it's been faster than yesterday. It's been faster. No videos today. So yeah, again, either you scan the QR code or you type menti.com and enter that code, and the question hopefully will appear. Overcome them. That one is easy, okay. Okay. Mm-hmm. Okay, so we already have a few answers. Basically, yeah, that your expectations are in line with what we plan to do in most cases, no? Because, yeah, the goal of this session will be to work on the barriers that have been identified and to co-create an action plan. No? One question is about the next step of the project. So after we finish with today's session, well, there are a couple of steps that we have to follow, but basically the two most important things are, on the one hand, to prepare to be presented. So we will elaborate those two concept notes, and those are like the two most important steps ahead of us in the project. Then When it comes to funding, we will not, are like 2 comments, we will not focus much on funding sources and so on. So we go back to the slides. Please, Jocelyn. If you can. Yeah, very good. Okay. And now I'm in control. So, well, just as a reminder, no, because when it comes to climate change, it's not like, okay, we're going to do everything we can, which, yeah, we're going to do everything we can. But as a country, we have some commitments, okay, internationally. These commitments are expressed in different documents and in different reference papers, but the most important one is what is called the NDC, the Nationally Determined Contribution of the country, okay, which is like what St. Kitts and Nevis has said to the international community that we plan to do here, okay? This is our goal, this is our commitment. So basically, the NDC of St. Kitts and Nevis has 2 main components, like any other NDC: mitigation and adaptation. Okay, I guess all of you are familiar with these concepts, and yesterday we talked a little bit about them, but mitigation is about what can we do to reduce emissions, okay, and to capture carbon, whereas adaptation is what we can do in order to be less vulnerable to climate change impact, okay? When it comes to mitigation, we have a very strong goal to meet, which is to reduce CO2 emissions in the country by 61% by 2030 as compared to 2010 levels. Okay, this is a very ambitious commitment, but also this is what we call a commitment. Okay, countries have conditional and unconditional commitments. So a conditional commitment is when you say, okay, this is what I plan to do, but I will do this if I receive international funding. Okay, so what St. Kitts and Nevis has said is, this is my goal, but this is conditional to receiving international funding. If I do not receive international funding, I cannot commit to meeting this goal. Okay, so this is a goal. It's ambitious, but still it's conditioned to the fact that we receive international finance. And when it comes to adaptation, well, it's more complicated to formulate quantitative objectives. When it comes to adaptation, you need to have a lot of information, and you need to have a lot of analysis about climate change, which, by the way, was one of the components that we suggested yesterday, in the second project idea, which is to do a vulnerability assessment of the different sectors so that we can quantify that vulnerability. But so far, the commitment is to improve resilience and capacities to adapt to the impacts of climate change and ensure the well-being and prosperity of the population and the health of natural resources. It's a little bit broader. Okay, like most adaptation commitments are. But this is what the country has said internationally that it's planning to do. Okay, so can we do it? What do we need to do in order to be able to be successful with that? Well, we also know, this is something that it's also included in the NDC, that we lack, we are experiencing lack of funding when it comes to implementing adaptation actions in many sectors. This is something that it's explicitly stated, like one of the most vulnerable sectors, like in any other Caribbean countries, are agriculture, because of changes in temperature, changes in weather patterns, rainfall patterns, sea level rise, etc. Disaster risk reduction, because associated with climate change, there is an expected increase in extreme events, and this is something that we have to deal with. Health, in any topic related to increasing temperature, extreme events, etc. And also, we know that climate change may affect tourism, settlement, and infrastructure. Okay, this is an area in which we feel like we lack enough funding. And the same goes with water, okay, which is linked to sea level rise, but also the changing in rainfall patterns that we are experiencing, and changes in temperature also affect availability of water. Okay, and we also believe that this is something that we talked about yesterday, we don't have enough human resources, enough skills in order to be able to overcome the problems that we are experiencing in climate change adaptation in areas such as agriculture, disaster risk reduction, tourism, settlement and infrastructure, and water. So it's a little bit of the situation that we face according to this document. Okay, so how can we deal with that? Well, we believe, this is something that it's it's so obvious, no, that if we really want to be able to deal with climate change, both mitigation and adaptation, we need the private sector to get involved, okay? Because no, the private sector is responsible for most of the greenhouse gas emissions, and also many of the climate change impacts are linked to the private sector. But it's not the private sector alone, because the private sector needs help from the public sector. No? We need to work in a collaborative manner, trying to understand what is the role of each of them, no? Because even no matter what the private sector does, if there is no coordination, if there is no information coming from the private sector, it's from the public sector, it is very complicated to be able to do this, okay? So throughout the project, what we did was we identified key stakeholders that we believed have something to say about this problem that we are facing. We structured and conducted a few interviews, and we also did a literature analysis to make sure that what we were seeing in this interview was consistent with what the literature was saying and with what was happening in other countries. Okay? Basically, in the interviews, well, after an introduction, we evaluated the level of climate funding knowledge of the stakeholders. We also identified what are the climate finance needs, barriers, and opportunities, and of course, we did an activity on Mentimeter like we always do, and you already know. Okay? So this is a little bit the structure that we follow, and we're going to see the conclusions of these interviews, in which I know that some of you have participated. Okay? Basically, we went through different sectors. We have conversations with different sectors. Here you have the dates. All the interviews took place in June, and we have a meeting with services. We have 2 meetings with manufacturing. We had one with banking and security, another one with public and other sectors, one with energy, chemicals, and utilities, and the final one with agriculture. Okay, so those were the meetings that we had and where we obtained the information that I'm going to present now. Okay, the outcomes of these meetings were, as I have just said, to evaluate climate funding knowledge, identification of climate finance needs, barriers, which is where we plan to start with our action plan, and also climate finance opportunities. Okay. When it comes to knowledge, well, what we obtain, or this is how you feel, that are available out there, those were the 5 that were mentioned. On the one hand, private investors. Some people say, okay, it's about family and friends that can provide us with this funding. Also, government grant funding that is sometimes available from the local government, some grants. Also, international organizations, and in these interviews were mentioned USAID, German Development Bank, Caribbean Biodiversity Fund, or the OECF. Okay? Also, some of you have used fundraising platforms like GoFundMe, which I didn't know, by the way, and also, of course, and very relevant, local credit unions and banks, okay, that are an obvious source of finance and should be obviously strengthened in this process. No? We believe that they can give us many more help in this regard, and they can help us developing or understanding a climate finance mechanism. When it comes to climate finance barriers, what are the potential barriers that can affect our capacity to implement climate change actions? We feel like we need to understand capacity barriers. That's obvious, no? If you remember yesterday afternoon with the electric vehicle example, a lot of the groups, or almost all groups, mentioned the potential problem of not having people with enough skills, no, in order to implement these measures. When it comes to this specific case, climate finance, we feel that this can be a barrier as well. Also, policy barriers, when we don't have the laws, regulations, guidelines, and processes are not adapted to what we need in terms of climate finance, and also finance itself, that there are not sources available in order to, that can be obtained in order to fund climate change projects. Also, when it comes to gender, that can be a problem, if existing mechanisms do not take into account any gender issues, that this may end up being a problem, because of lack of access of women in particular to climate finance, and also age. This is something that is very often a barrier in many countries when it comes to having access to climate finance. So these were some of the barriers that we will have to deal with. As a result of the interview, here you have some common findings that we obtained in each and every sector, and then we will see specific barriers identified in specific sectors. No? One very clear was the need to increase awareness and education on climate change, sustainability, no? That there are not enough resources for the private sector and for the general population in order to understand this. No? And this is the starting point. No? If you don't have information, you cannot act, no? Because you don't know where you should go to, so you don't know the route. Also, that the idea that, and it is true, that the process of accessing finance can be complicated. This is something that was also discussed yesterday. No? One of the comments here was that it is complicated for small projects and for small projects implemented in small countries to having access to international climate finance, which is cumbersome, it's complicated, so this is obviously a barrier. Also, the idea that there is a skill gap or shortage, no, in terms of having people with enough capacity and knowledge to be able to implement projects. That's something that came up in each and every sector. And the idea that there is a need for for a stronger collaboration between different sectors and between private and public sector. Okay, that we need to create some kind of networks or ways so that the private sector can collaborate together and also hand in hand with the government. And also that's something that was mentioned in many cases, the threat that can be to be classified as a high-income country in order to have access to a specific international finance. Okay? On the other hand, the good news about being an island is that it provides a special access to some climate funds, but it's true that being classified as high-income country can be a threat in order to having access to some international sources. And then in the service sector, there were some specific comments like the difficulty of accessing finance in general, not just climate finance, in terms of time, in terms of cost effectiveness, that it was very complicated for the private sector, for the service sector to be able to have access to finance in general. Okay. Key projects that were mentioned were water management and aquaponic, renewable energy, and also a storage solution related to electrification. Also, the idea that the focus has to be placed in targeting business with enough expertise and enough experience, okay, so that they can provide a good case, a good example for other sectors. Also, the low level of digitalization in the country can be a problem for accessing climate finance, and it is an obvious problem. And the fact that the focus should be placed on improving the attractiveness of green finance option. If it's the same as traditional funding, we're not going to be any better. So we need climate finance to be different and to be better and more easily accessible. Okay. When it comes to the manufacturing sector, well, I have already mentioned this. The question of the high-income country was also included as one of the general conclusions. Also, the risks of extreme events, hurricane, droughts, may affect water access, power costs. It's a risk for the sector in general and has to be overcome. When it comes to key projects, we have water management and aquaponics as well, renewable and solar energy, soil erosion, and development of physical protections against climate change. Okay, this is something that, this is what we call hard adaptation measures. You are measures that normally require higher level of investment, but they can be effective depending on the sector. But these are measures that have normally a high fixed cost, so it's something that you have to analyze in detail. Also, the idea, it was mentioned that there is some gender bias reported in terms of that it's more complicated for women to have access to finance, and also high interest rates from banks. Okay. When it comes to banking and securities, they mention some barriers to gender equality, as they don't see so many women involved in medium and small companies. Also, the need of having some government policy and regulation was mentioned. And when it comes to key projects, they mention water management, renewable and solar energy, physical readiness to extreme weather, in particular properties being able to withstand high category hurricane and flooding. So you can see that the key projects are not so different from within the different sectors, so they are quite the same. When it comes to the public sector, the main conclusion, well, the main projects that were identified were again water management, renewable and solar energy, pest management, and small or ecotourism. Okay, Those were the sectors that were identified by the public sector and others as the most important sectors in which to implement actions. Okay. Energy, chemical, and utilities, I think this is the last sector. They mentioned the difficulty in receiving products in timely and cost-effective manner. This is a barrier that you face, no, because you are an island, no, and it makes it more complicated to having access to some products. And also, when it comes to key project, water management, renewable and solar energy, and focus on storage solutions. So again, as you can see, many of the key projects have been repeated in the different sectors. Agriculture, same idea of difficulty in receiving products, the lack of local green funding sources, that the local sources are not needed in order to implement climate change project. Low carbon and climate resilient technologies can make a big change, in particularly if they provide more efficient ways of doing things. Also, reliable access, energy access and security is something that is good by itself, okay, and can be strengthened by climate finance, and also water access and management, can be areas where there would be opportunities if we are able to obtain climate finance. This is like the classification of, how can I say it, of projects by the Green Climate Fund. So the Climate Fund says that within mitigation and adaptation, they can fund what they call, it's like very broad categories, but they can fund projects related to energy generation and access, transport, forest and land use, buildings, cities, industries, and appliances. And when it comes to adaptation, the four big groups are health, food, and water security, livelihoods of people and communities, ecosystems and ecosystem services, and infrastructure and built environment. Those are like the four big areas of the Green Climate Fund. And we believe that 100% of the projects that were mentioned during the interview and the projects that are included in the national NDC can fit into this category. So this means that in theory, the type of projects that have been identified fit very well into the categories of projects potentially funded by the Green Climate Fund. And finally, just to finalize, some examples of investment that were included in the NDC. The NDC is that, again, that document that summarizes the commitments of the country to the international community, and we said, no, we have a reduction of 61% conditional to receiving international funding, and we have a commitment in adaptation in order to be more resilient so that it doesn't affect the people or the ecosystem. So, but we said this is conditional, okay? Conditional of what? So the NDC identifies some interventions in terms of mitigation and adaptation that are like, this is how we're going to meet our goals in mitigation and adaptation, okay? And these actions have been identified, okay? So we have here 637 solar photovoltaic plants